Whoops. Okay. Technical difficulties from the very beginning. Hi, welcome to the African American struggle for equality. This, of course, is I am Professor TOVANCHE, and this is going to be our first lecture video. I ask that you remember that these lectures are, well, the lectures are solid. However, the performance may not be. This is, of course, a strange medium. Um, and so the lectures are, or at least the presentations, I should say, they're not going to be altogether refined. You're going to be hearing ums, and I might have some technical difficulties here and there. There's very little production value involved here, other than, of course, all the material that I've compiled in my lecture, and of course the PowerPoints that I hope to share with you. So, with that in mind, I think we should move into this. The first thing we're going to talk about is Africa before Portuguese exploration, right? Got to begin with Africa if we're going to be talking about the African American struggle for equality. Now, we should start with a couple, some broad sort of strokes. Geographically, Africa is a huge continent. It is massive. We know that it has various climates. We know it to be very, very hot for sure, but it has a varied climate because it has a varied topography. By topography, I mean it's not flat, it's not all mountain, right? It means that there are various forms of formations, land formations all over Africa. You have grasslands, you have shore deserts, but you also have rivers and rainforests. But we do know that it is a harsh environment. Now, today, it has a huge population, dozens of countries there, thousands of ethnic groups with varied customs and languages and religions. We know that today, a lot of these people face uncertain existence, especially with the changes in climate that are going on. There are shortages of food and water. There's a lot of poverty. There's a huge exodus of people from Africa trying to get into Europe. Now, a lot of these societies, these countries, a lot of these people, they're still largely emerging from a colonial past. Let's just put it bluntly, European countries had for a very long time exploited the continent, raped the continent of a lot of the resources that it had, not just its people, but of course, minerals and all sorts of metals. Now, the natural resources is what we're talking about, natural resources and people. Now, this, of course, began to change only by the mid-20th century. And so it's easy for a lot of people to see Africa as a backwards place, but we have to keep the history in mind. People who see it this way see it as though it has no history, as though Africa made no contributions to humankind. In fact, a lot of historians said this for a very, very long time, but they were wrong. As we know, Africa is in fact the cradle of humanity. All modern humans can be traced to the blood of Africans living long ago. Humans evolved there first, then of course they spread out to all corners of the earth. We know that hunter-gatherers, and it is what it sounds like, they're either hunting, right, some sort of fauna, meaning animals, or gathering some sort of flora, meaning plants and such. These hunter-gatherers moved out of Africa and into the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Now, Africa itself became a home to complex societies. Even though many people left Africa, a lot of people remained. A lot of them remained hunter-gatherers, and they stayed in the area. But over time, most of these hunter-gatherer societies actually transformed into what are known as sedentary societies. Sedentary meaning settled. We're talking about people with agriculture. We're talking about people with animal husbandry, right? Meaning, they have some sort of livestock or another, all right? And so these are settled societies with complex cultures, with a social hierarchy, with a political hierarchy, right? Where, people, people sort of, quote unquote, know their place. And eventually, these societies, of course, grew into powerful kingdoms. There are some huge kingdoms that existed 5,000 or so years ago in Africa. Now, we know that the most famous is, of course, Egypt, right? So about 5,000 years ago, meaning 3000 BCE, before the Common Era, 3000 before Christ, if you prefer, right? These ancient kingdoms, like the Egyptians and the Nubians, really held sway over much of Africa. The Egyptians, of course, are the best known, right? They're the civilization of science and learning, the pyramids and the Sphinx, all that good stuff that we like to watch on, Discovery Channel or whatever it is. This society had immense power. The lesser knowns were the Nubians, and there were a bunch of others as well, but these are probably the two major civilizations at the time. Now, not a whole lot is known about the fall of these societies. In fact, the Egyptian dynasties, right, rose and fell. There were always different kingdoms, and we would see that some, much like the Chinese dynasties, right, some would rise and fall, and then rise and fall. So these civilizations, we don't know how they fell, but we do know a whole lot about how they lived. And I don't want to get too deeply into that, much more than to say these were complex societies, powerful kingdoms, strong kingdoms that held sway over a large area, I should say. Now, moving to about, some time later, about 1200 AD, right? 1200 after the birth of Christ, if you prefer, just so everybody understands where we're at in time. We have what are called the medieval empires. Now these are they're not medieval like Europe, they're not walking around in armor or on riding horses as in this sort of shining armor knights sort of plate material. No, it's called medieval because of the era, right? Here we have empires like Mali and Ghana and Songhay. These are huge empires. They're massive. And what we see here is the growth of large populations of people concentrated under a very strong hierarchical system. We have the growth also along with these medieval empires, large city-states, large states that are smaller than these empires, but which also hold sway. Now, a lot of these states and these empires traded with each other, and a lot of this extended across much of the continent. There was great wealth and a great movement of people across the continent. Now, again, we have to talk about how Africa, even before the Europeans came, had a massive complex civilization, a wealthy civilization. It's not to say that everybody was rich, but there were some strong, powerful kingdoms there. And why did these medieval empires fall? Well, a lot of it has to do, no surprise, with warfare, right? Internal upheaval, insurrections, also foreign wars. But a huge thing, of course, was droughts. It seems like Africa for a long time has been beset by droughts. Now, we're moving more into the modern era, right? Right around 1500, closer to the time of Europeans coming into or crossing the Atlantic, I should say, to the modern era, where you have a very diverse set of civilizations. A lot of these larger empires had been sort of broken down, at least they had their rise, but by about 1500, there's still some strong kingdoms, but they're not these huge empires as they used to be. There's not a whole lot of them. You see that most of Africa is full of tribal folk. You have villages. Now, some kingdoms remain, and you do have several city-states, but most people are what you would call stateless, meaning they don't really belong to what we would consider a city-state or a strong political structure. There were, of course, kinship ties, meaning family ties. There were friendship ties and all sorts of things. But there wasn't this idea of belonging to a nation as we understand it. Most people are clannish, right? So they have these strong kinship ties, meaning family ties. And rule here is based on ancestry. In fact, some of them believed to have ruled according to divine right, right? So those civilizations during the modern era that had a social hierarchy and some sense of nationalism as it were. Again, we're only scratching the surface here. There were some of those, and those civilizations did tend to be based, at least the ruling function, or the way they were ruled, were based on ancestral right. Some people would call it divine right. Now, a lot of these civilizations were either matrilineal, meaning from the mother, right? So women held some sway here, or they were patrilineal. So you had a mixture or at least it wasn't necessarily that all societies in Africa were patrilineal, meaning descended from the pater, the father, right? Some of them were matrilineal, descended from the mother, mater. Excuse me. A lot of these people shared land, very similar to what we understand as being the sort of the Native American tradition. This similar to the to the Native Americans, they looked to their ancestors, right? They believed that they owed a great deal to their ancestors, that they were duty bound to protect and develop the land. And there was a sense of shared ownership. Usage is very important to them. Use the land. It is there. It gives life. And very much like the Native American sort of sentiments with regard to land. Now, even as I mentioned, I should say that larger states existed too at this time. They had some political and military and economic strengths, but again, what we have here, I don't want to say hodgepodge because that makes it seem like it's just all over the place, but there was a variety of civilizations that existed here by the time the Europeans come to Africa. And when we think about the Europeans coming to Africa, particularly with regard to what we're going to see later with the transportation of Africans to the Americas over the Atlantic, we have to look at West Africa. It is West Africa, this area here, Mauritania and so forth, Ghana, you can see it on the map. It is that area there that juts out, right? It is from here that countless Africans would be shipped across the Atlantic. So when we think about what the Portuguese are going to do, when we think about the Spanish and the Dutch and the English and everybody going to Africa to capture, or I should say trade in slaves, we're talking largely about the western coast and that area up there, sort of in the northwest, that juts out, that big area there that juts out underneath Spain. So that is sort of a quick and dirty with regard to Africa before Portuguese exploration. There's a lot more to this. I wish I could get into it, but we have a lot to cover this semester. I mean, we have to cover centuries and centuries, right? In some areas, or some schools, I should say, this class is broken up into two different sections, meaning you might take African American History 1 and African American History 2. But we here, when we're talking about the African American struggle for equality, we're going to have to cover a lot of ground. So let's do our best. I will cut this in just a moment, and we'll post this. So hopefully you've gotten this far, and you like what you see, and you should move into the next set of materials. Next time, we're going to talk, of course, about how Africans were brought here from Africa to the Americas. Thank you for listening. Signing off. See you next time. Bye.